Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, welcome back.
Today we're going to be looking at something I think a lot of us have either experienced personally or at least seen going on around us.
Right.
And that is toxic workplaces.
Yeah.
And the source material for this deep dive is a blog post called Arjun's Story.
Okay.
Part 1, The Struggles of a Toxic Workplace.
Interesting.
And Arjun was, super excited to start this new job.
Yeah.
And it turned out that things were not quite as he expected.
It's such a common story. Sadly, a lot of people find themselves in these types of situations. And what I find really interesting about this blog post is the question that it poses to the reader, which is, what would you do if you were in Arjun's shoes?
Yeah, it really makes you think about it.
Yeah.
So to set the scene a little bit,
Yeah.
Arjun's boss had kind of a, let's say, unconventional management style.
Okay.
And we're not just talking about, constructive criticism.
Right.
It was way beyond that.
Yeah, the blog details how his boss would constantly criticize him publicly, use belittling tactics, really trying to create a culture of fear and intimidation, which, of course, as you can imagine, is incredibly damaging to morale and productivity.
Yeah, and there's this one really powerful image in the blog where Arjun is looking at himself in the mirror, and he says he literally does not recognize the person staring back at him.
Wow.
It's like this toxic environment is just chipping away at his sense of self.
That's a powerful image. It really speaks to the emotional toll that these kinds of environments can have on a person. It's not just about, performance reviews or whatever. It's really about how that constant negativity can chip away at your self-worth.
Yeah, it's not just external, it becomes internalized. And that seems to be where this feeling of self-doubt creeps in.
Yeah.
And ultimately what's often called imposter syndrome, which is,
Yeah.
You feel like a fraud. You feel like you don't belong. You're going to be found out at any moment. And there's this description in the blog of Arjun just staring at a blank document, completely frozen, unable to work.
I've totally been there. Like, you just hit a wall. And what's so insidious about self-doubt is that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start to question your abilities, which of course then impacts your performance. And then that just feeds the cycle of doubt. It's like this downward spiral.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. And to make matters worse, it seems like the toxicity at work started to bleed into Arjun's personal life.
Okay.
He started to withdraw from his wife, Mira,
Right.
and was reluctant to even talk about his struggles with her.
That's another, unfortunately, very common reaction to this kind of stress. It's really hard to leave those negative emotions at work. So we often bring them home with us unintentionally, and that can strain our relationships.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in the blog, you can really feel that sense of isolation, both for Arjun and for his wife. And things kind of build to this breaking point where Arjun's sitting in his car after a particularly bad day at work, and he just feels totally trapped. And this is where the blog throws that question back at us. What would you do? Stay or leave?
It's a tough one. There's really no easy answer. Both staying and leaving have potential risks and rewards.
Yeah, there are definite downsides to both. On the one hand, staying in a toxic environment long term can really damage your mental health.
Oh, absolutely. But on the other hand, leaving a job, especially if you don't have another one lined up, can create a lot of financial stress and uncertainty. Plus, there's often that fear of the unknown. Like, will I be able to find something better?
Yeah, it's really complicated calculation.
Yeah.
You're weighing your values, your financial situation, your career goals, even the impact on your relationships.
Right. It's not a decision to be made lightly.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think just acknowledging that complexity is a really good first step. It's okay not to have all the answers right away. The important thing is to, gather information, think about your options carefully, maybe even reach out to a trusted friend or mentor, or even a career counselor for advice.
I think that outside perspective can be so valuable.
Yeah.
Because when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to see things clearly. And so that's where part 1 of Arjun's story ends, at this crossroads.
Okay.
He's facing this really tough decision with potential consequences that could really ripple through his life.
And that's what makes part 2 so intriguing. We're left wondering, which path does he choose? And will it lead to relief or regret?
And that is exactly what we will be exploring next time on the Deep Dive.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in, And I think what makes Arjun's story so relatable is that it really highlights this very real dilemma that so many people face. What do you do when you're stuck in a toxic workplace?
Yeah, it's not always a clear-cut situation,
Okay.
right? Like, there's so many different factors to consider.
Right, exactly. And as we were talking about earlier, Those factors can be so different for different people. You know, for some people, the biggest concern might be the financial implications of leaving.
Right.
While for others, it might be more about, you know, the impact on their career trajectory.
Yeah. And let's not forget the emotional toll too, right?
Yeah.
Like walking away from a job, even a toxic one,
Yeah.
it takes a lot of courage. It's easy to feel like you failed in some way, even when it's not your fault at all.
Oh, absolutely. And that feeling of failure can be really tough to shake. We often internalize those negative experiences, and it can take time to process those emotions and rebuild our confidence.
So the blog post kind of leaves us hanging at the end of part one. We don't actually know what decision Arjun makes.
Right.
But there's this hint that his choice is going to have a pretty significant impact on his life.
Exactly. You know, it poses that question, will his decision lead to relief or will it lead to regret? And I think that's a really powerful way to frame, you know, the potential consequences of our choices, not just in the workplace, but in life in general.
Definitely makes you think about the ripple effects. But wouldn't you say that, you know, in most cases, leaving a toxic job is the healthier choice in the long run?
I mean, it's tempting to say that leaving is always the best option, but it's not always that simple. You know, sometimes there might be valid reasons to stay and try to improve the situation. Like maybe you have really strong relationships with your colleagues.
Yeah.
Or you believe that the organization is capable of change.
Right. It's not necessarily about finding the quote-unquote perfect solution, but rather the one that aligns best with your own values and circumstances.
Yeah.
And maybe even your personality.
Exactly. You know, some people are just better equipped to handle conflict and navigate difficult situations than others.
That's true.
And it's important to remember that, you know, sometimes even the most well thought out plans can go awry. We might make a decision that seems right at the time, only to realize later on that it wasn't the best choice. You know, hindsight is 20/20, as they say.
Yeah.
But I think the key is to try to gather as much information as possible, weigh the pros and cons carefully, and then make the best decision you can with the information you have at the time.
And be kind to yourself throughout the process.
Yes, absolutely. Making difficult decisions, especially in these kinds of high-stress situations, can be incredibly emotionally draining. So it's crucial to acknowledge those feelings and practice self-compassion.
I love that you bring up self-compassion. It's so easy to be hard on ourselves when things don't go as planned.
Yeah.
Or we feel like we made a mistake.
Right.
But beating ourselves up doesn't really help anyone. It
Yeah.
just adds to the stress and the negativity.
Exactly. It's about learning to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a friend going through a similar situation.
So before we move on to the final part of Arjun's story,
Yeah.
I want to kind of shift gears a bit and talk about the bigger picture for a minute.
Okay.
What are some of the systemic factors that contribute to the prevalence of toxic workplaces? Is it a leadership issue, a cultural problem, or some combination of both?
It's definitely a complex issue with multiple contributing factors, but research suggests that certain leadership styles, particularly those that emphasize, you know, control and dominance over collaboration and empowerment, are more likely to foster those kinds of toxic environments.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, if the leader sets a tone of disrespect and negativity, it's bound to trickle down through the ranks. But it's not always just about the leader, is it?
Right, yeah.
Sometimes there's a broader cultural issue within an organization that allows that toxicity to thrive.
Absolutely. If there's a lack of accountability,
Right.
poor communication, or just a general tolerance for bad behavior,
Yeah.
it creates this breeding ground for toxicity.
So what can organizations do to address this? Is it about implementing stricter policies, providing training on conflict resolution, or fostering a more positive and inclusive culture overall?
It's likely a combination of all of those things, but I think it has to start with a genuine commitment from leadership to create a healthy and respectful work environment. You know, they need to walk the talk, not just pay lip service to these values.
And what about individuals? What can we do in our everyday interactions to promote a more positive and supportive workplace, even in the face of negativity?
That's where things like setting boundaries come in, speaking up against injustice when we see it, offering support to our colleagues. Even small acts of kindness and empathy can make a difference.
That's such an important point. Sometimes we underestimate the power of our individual actions.
It's easy to feel helpless in the face of a toxic workplace culture, but we all have a role to play in creating positive change.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Arjun's story, I want to pose a question to you, our listener. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a toxic workplace? And if so, what strategies did you find helpful in navigating that situation?
Yeah, we'd love to hear your insights. because sharing our experiences, even the difficult ones, can help us all learn and grow, and maybe even inspire others to take action.
Yeah, it really is true, that even those small actions can kind of have that ripple effect. Sometimes I think we get caught up thinking that we have to make these big, grand gestures to really combat negativity. But often it's really those like everyday acts of kindness, those little moments of support. They can actually shift the energy in a really meaningful way.
Absolutely. It's about creating that culture
Yeah.
where people feel seen and heard and valued. And that starts with each of us, just
Right.
those small things.
And speaking of, feeling seen and heard, that kind of brings us back to Arjun's story. If you remember, the blog post kind of left us on a bit of a cliffhanger.
Right. We're still wondering what decision he makes and how it ultimately impacts his life.
Exactly. But even without knowing, the final outcome of his story, I think we can still take away some pretty valuable insights from his experience.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Arjun's story is a really good reminder that even talented and successful people can be victims of these toxic work environments. It's not a reflection of their worth or their ability.
It's more about the environment itself.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think it highlights the importance of recognizing those signs. What are the signs of a toxic workplace? And then once you recognize those signs, taking steps to protect yourself.
Yeah.
Whether that's, setting boundaries, seeking support from others, or ultimately deciding that you need to leave that environment for your own well-being.
Because ultimately, I think we all deserve to work in an environment that respects us, that allows us to thrive, that supports our well-being.
Absolutely.
And that kind of brings us to, I think, the bigger question that this blog post raises, which is, what can we do, both individually and collectively, to create those more positive and supportive workplaces for everyone?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not an easy answer, but it's a conversation that we need to be having.
It is.
And I think it starts with awareness. Recognizing that workplace toxicity, it's a systemic issue that requires a multifaceted approach to really address it.
Yeah, it's not just a simple fix.
Right. We have to look at those root causes, whether it's, leadership styles, organizational culture, or even those societal norms that kind of perpetuate these unhealthy dynamics.
It's bigger than just one person or one company even.
Exactly.
And it's also about empowering individuals to speak up, to set those boundaries that we were talking about, to advocate for their own well-being.
Because at the end of the day, creating a positive and supportive work environment benefits everyone.
Totally.
It leads to greater productivity, increased creativity, and a happier and healthier workforce overall.
And who doesn't want that, right?
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Arjun's experience, I want to leave you with a little bit of a challenge. What's one small step that you can take today to make your own workplace just a little bit better? Maybe it's offering a word of encouragement to a colleague. Maybe it's speaking up against a microaggression that you witness. Or maybe it's just simply committing to being more mindful of your own interactions with the people around you.
Those small actions can have a really big impact over time. And collectively, we can create this ripple effect of positivity that can transform our workplaces and ultimately even transform our world.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into Arjun's experience with a toxic workplace. We'll be back soon with more deep dives, exploring other fascinating topics that matter. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a better place. One conversation, one action, one deep dive at a time.